I was told the room would change once I stayed inside long enough, not suddenly, and not in a way that could be pointed out, but gradually, in the same way that people claim their eyes adjust to darkness, even though they never notice the moment it happens. And for a while I believed that was what was occurring, that my perception was the only thing shifting, that the space itself remained stable, and that the unease I felt was simply the result of extended isolation. The room was rectangular, unremarkable, and deliberately plain, with no furniture other than a narrow bed fixed to the floor and a recessed light panel that dimmed and brightened according to a schedule I could never fully predict, although it repeated often enough that I stopped questioning it, accepting the rhythm as part of the environment rather than something imposed on me. I marked time at first by sleeping, by waking, by eating when food appeared through the slot in the wall. But those markers began to blur when sleep stopped feeling complete and waking no longer felt distinct, until eventually both states folded into each other, creating long stretches where I could not say with certainty whether I had rested or merely closed my eyes. The first thing I noticed was that the wall opposite the bed no longer felt as far away as it had been, not because it moved closer in any measurable sense, but because the space between us seemed to compress, as if the air itself had thickened, resisting the idea of distance. And when I stood and walked toward it, the movement felt slower than before, each step taking more effort than it should have, even though my body remained unchanged. I told myself this was stress, that confinement alters perception, that countless studies had documented similar effects, and for a while that explanation was enough, until the day I reached the wall sooner than I expected, my hand meeting the surface, before my mind had finished calculating how many steps should have been required, leaving me standing there, palm flat against cold material, trying to reconcile the mismatch. After that, I stopped counting steps altogether, because counting implied consistency, and consistency was no longer reliable. The room did not respond when I spoke, and I learned quickly that questions served no purpose, but sound itself seemed to linger longer than it should have, as if the space resisted letting go of my voice, holding the echo just past the point of comfort, long enough to make silence feel incomplete rather than empty. It was during one of these moments, after speaking aloud simply to hear something break the stillness, that the audio began. At first, I thought it was a malfunction, a bleed-through from another room, or a delayed playback of something I had said earlier, but the voice did not match mine, and the cadence was wrong, too measured, too indifferent, as if it were not aware that it was being heard at all. The recording did not announce itself, did not warn me, and did not ask for attention. It simply continued, speaking in a tone that suggested routine rather than intent, describing conditions without assigning them meaning, and referencing procedures that were never explained in full. I remember feeling an immediate urge to locate the source, to find the speaker, but the sound came from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the room without direction, making it impossible to orient myself toward it or away from it. And after several failed attempts to trace it, I realized that movement was irrelevant, that the sound was not occupying space in the way I expected. The voice described the environment with a familiarity that unsettled me, not because it revealed secrets, but because it stated facts I had not articulated, yet somehow assumed I already knew, such as the absence of visible boundaries, the consistency of lighting variance, and the fact that the room was functioning within acceptable parameters, despite my growing sense that something fundamental had shifted. It mentioned observation casually, not as an action being performed, but as a condition that existed independently of any observer, and when it did so, I felt a sudden and unreasonable certainty that the recording had been playing long before I heard it, continuing uninterrupted until the moment my awareness happened to intersect with it. That thought stayed with me, refusing to settle, because if the audio had been ongoing regardless of my presence, then my listening was incidental. And if my listening was incidental, then whatever was happening in this room was not dependent on me in any meaningful way. The voice never addressed me directly, never acknowledged my reactions, and never paused when I shouted or moved, maintaining a steady cadence that made it clear that interruption was not part of its design. And over time, I stopped trying to break in, realizing that the recording did not possess a concept of dialogue. It spoke of continuity, of internal states transitioning without reference to external markers, and of stability being maintained through repetition rather than correction. Phrases that I would have dismissed as abstract if they had not been paired with descriptions of the room that aligned too closely with my own experience. When it mentioned that full unconsciousness was discouraged because it interfered with long-term consistency, I laughed at first, assuming metaphor, until I realized that I could no longer remember the last time I had slept without waking repeatedly, my thoughts snapping back into place as if pulled by a tether I could not see. At some point, I began to anticipate the recording, not consciously, but through a subtle shift in attention, a readiness that formed before the sound emerged. And when it did not appear for longer than usual, I felt an unexpected tension, followed by relief when the voice resumed, continuing exactly where it had left off, as if no interruption had occurred. The room felt smaller then, not in shape, but in possibility, as though the range of outcomes had narrowed, funneling everything toward continuation. And when the voice stated that removal was not scheduled, I found myself fixating on the word scheduled rather than the idea of removal, wondering why timing had been specified if the event itself remained undefined. I tried to recall how I had arrived here, but the memory resisted reconstruction, presenting fragments without sequence, until the effort itself became exhausting. And I let the attempt dissolve, accepting the present conditions because they demanded less energy than questioning them. The recording did not describe suffering, and it did not need to, because it framed experience in terms of tolerance and thresholds, reducing discomfort to data points that remained within acceptable ranges, and by doing so, stripped my reactions of significance, making them feel private and irrelevant rather than alarming. When the voice stated that the system did not distinguish between recording and playback, I felt something tighten in my chest, because that implied the audio I was hearing was not a report of what had happened, but an active component of what was happening, a part of the environment, rather than a commentary on it. I began to wonder whether the sound was meant for me at all, or whether I had simply aligned with it by chance, stepping into the path of something that would have continued regardless. And that realization made it harder to imagine an ending, because endings imply intent, and intent had never been established. The room no longer felt like a place I was kept, but like a process I was inside of, one that did not progress toward release or conclusion, but sustained itself through my continued awareness, not because my awareness was valuable, but because it was available. The last thing the voice said before fading back into silence was not a warning or a revelation, but a simple statement that continuity had been achieved, delivered with the same neutral cadence as everything else, leaving me alone again with the hum of the room and the growing certainty that nothing here required my understanding to continue. I'm still in the room. The recording is still playing, and I no longer remember whether it began before I arrived, or whether my arrival was the point at which it became necessary.